these programs. And actually, these are not the programs we're here to talk about. What we would like to see is another program created, or what we'd like to see is a real opening of spaces for third country nationals. Now, if that doesn't happen, we know that it's not going to work, but we're also not going to continue to pretend that this is working for all migrants. So I think that at the end of the day, being very tactful, and that's the uniqueness also of Diaspora, that you basically have nothing to lose, because you go and knock on every door with philanthropy, private organizations, international organizations. So you have the same approach, but your focus remains on the work on the homelands. And I think this is where you have the uniqueness of the Diaspora. But I also wanted to just say that for Diaspora as well, getting out of the crisis is almost a thing that is like, it's a life or death. We need to get out of this crisis. And so you demand a lot of accountability. You demand a lot of action. And I think that also has made some international organizations be able to make that push and move, because sometimes they need that as advocacy in-house to reorganize themselves and readjust their mechanisms. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That brings a really good leeway in talking about accountability, Nick. We've been struggling, I've been part of that system, right? Really bringing in, since I guess my involvement in the tsunami evaluation, we've been really thinking about how do we increase accountability to affected populations. So in your view, having worked on this for many years, what are, how far have we come, and what are still the challenges? Because it sounds like it really is about what do we do best for the people who are affected.
Thanks very much. Great to be here. Maybe I would like to sort of concentrate a bit more on the sort of Diaspora elements of the accountability puzzle, but just you're asking about the broader set of issues.
As well, yeah.
I think what we've seen over the last 15 years or so is a recognition that without greater accountability to affected people, on the part of the system, we're not going to make the kind of impact that Paddy's sister would like to see. We're not going to see action, and we're not going to be able to measure it. And so I think there's a tendency to see accountability to affected people as a kind of soft issue, but actually it's a very hard one. It's about managing your performance more effectively. And you'll only manage your performance effectively if people trust you, as we've heard, and you get people to trust you if they think you're competent, if they understand how the resources that you are responsible for allocating are used. We saw this very recently in some research we did in Haiti, where people are absolutely up in arms about how resources that they see coming into the country do or do not trickle down to them. They're super keen on whether you're competent or not, whether organizations are competent. They hone in on that very quickly. So these are all issues that one wants to get to grips with. One also wants to try and understand the extent to which services are provided in a quality way, and that means timeliness of provision, it means fairness of provision, it means relevance of what's provided. And then, of course, there's a whole range of issues around the future and your prospects for the future, and whether what's being done is going to help you stand on your own feet, and whether you have agency. These are the things that really concern people. And if you manage to sort of understand where they stand on those issues, you'll be in very good shape. The problem is that we don't understand where people stand on these issues, because we don't ask them for the most part. And if we do ask them, we don't do anything with the information we get. We hear a lot about survey fatigue, and I always say we don't suffer from survey fatigue. We suffer from fatigue at not seeing anything done in response to the answers we've all provided. Fatigue. So that's a really important lesson. I think in the broader international system, it's quite amazing. In the humanitarian system, we've managed to sort of turn accountability to affected people, instead of being a sort of eminently political activity because it's trying to redress the imbalance of power within the system. We've managed to turn it into a series of mechanisms and activities, very low-hanging fruit, helplines, basic communications channels, managed by working groups, which DEMAC, the last C, is about coordination, and it seems to me that accountability to affected people is the kind of lowest order within the coordination systems in most country teams. So I think what we need to do is to sort of move it up a notch, and we need to make sure it's properly resourced, that we use feedback from people as a real metric of performance, It's not it's not the only metric, but it's the most important unmeasured metric of performance, and we need to make sure that we include it centrally. I'll finish quickly. But so the other thing that really sort of I think is important to recognize is that one really needs to include this with a sense of urgency. There's such a tendency to sort of sit back and wait for things to happen. And we should be really impatient for this change and not relegate it to one of the more subsidiary activities that exists on the humanitarian plane.
Great, thank
There's
you.
an arm up here.
Hey, Nick, is there a methodology of assessing these different groups as to their viability, their focus on finance, their deliverability? I mean, my gentleman friend here, we went through ISO 9000 many years ago, right? There's got to be an equivalent process for NGOs. Is there?
This is not my area of expertise, but there are bodies that do look at the basic competence of organizations. I think the Danish government is very focused on that. We focus more on whether the people who are supposed to benefit from these activities feel that the organizations are doing a good job. And I guess it would be, it should sound an alarm if people feel consistently that their basic, most prioritized needs are not being met, that they don't generally trust the people who are providing aid. That should be an alarm in the ears of donors, whether they're from the diaspora or from elsewhere.
Yeah, great, thanks. And yeah, really important about how and also that urgency. And I feel, Lars, in terms of your global view, and you've had a lot of different conversations in your humanitarian conversations as well, how do you see this ecosystem? Because it seems like, and I just want to go back to that issue of power, because it's so prominent, right? How do you ensure that that power is shared in the ecosystem?
Yeah. So I think that the first thing that happened to me when I stepped into the room was I heard your keynote, and it was about trust. It was about spaces, about time, and I looked down at the notes I had prepared for today, and suddenly they seemed sort of very aid speak, very sort of technocratic in their nature. So I decided to throw them away. Thank you for that. And instead, maybe get into the tango a little bit, if we can. You know, I was once at a panel at the ICSC where we talked about humanitarian access. And on that panel was colleagues from Ukraine, colleagues from Syria, and a couple of us international from the echo chamber. And it was about halfway through the conversation before I realized that when the colleagues from Syria and Ukraine spoke about humanitarian access, they were talking about money or access to meetings, access to us, actually. Whereas when we speak of humanitarian access, of course it is our ability to operate, our almost right to operate wherever we want, right? And so you speak about power, I think, and you spoke about what I would call the humanitarian narrative, how that is shaped. And I would say if we want to have a good dialogue, we need to start with the power in the language, in the concepts we use, in the way that we have put together the humanitarian sector, the technocratic way that we talk about our business, the way the ISC, the cluster system is put together, and just how complicated and weird that can be sometimes, right? And so when we hear tango, when we hear the trust between a mother and a child, those are language that we don't speak in the Palais des Nations very often, at least when we talk about coordination. And I think we have to recognize that the fundamental difference between a large humanitarian organization with 18, 20,000 employees and a small network of people from the diaspora with different agendas, different histories, trying to engage to help their homeland. Those are two fundamentally different animals. Right? And I think that's great news, because I think the fundamental problem we have in the humanitarian sector and our inability to change in spite of the numerous humanitarian reforms we've had over the past couple of decades is a lack of institutional diversity, if you want. It is that the sector by and large is dominated by a few big agencies and a few big donors who shape the sector to suit their needs. I think that's why Nick has a job, right? It is that if this was really working, accountability to humanitarian or to affected populations would automatically be generated from what we do. It wouldn't be a side project that Nick had to launch. It would be part of our core business. It should be a natural product of what we do. And so we do have a problem, and we do need to seek a new way of working. And I'd like actually to change the banner here. It says coordination. I think that's wrong. I think what we're looking for is a new collaborative modality. We're looking for a way for very different animals to engage in a relationship that produces shared value. That's not coordination, at least not in the way we speak about it in the humanitarian sector. Coordination there means, by and large, deconflicting, so we don't step on each other's toes. That's not what we're after here. We are after shared value. We have a shared purpose to help these populations. How do we do that? And then maybe a challenge to both sides. Right? I think in engaging in that dialogue, in figuring out how do we actually construct some kind of partnership here, maybe the best question to ask ourselves on both sides is, what are you not able to do? Right? An ecosystem works because it's diverse. A herd of elephants is not an ecosystem, it's a herd of elephants. Right? You need some mice, you need some different animals. Now, different animals can do different things. So what is it that Diaspora is uniquely good at? But equally important, what is it you can't do? And for big aid, if you want, what is it that you're fantastic at? Scale, minimizing financial risks, all of equality principles, all of those things. But what is it you're not good at? What are you not? And maybe it is in those spaces of what we are not that we'll find that shared value and that shared purpose. That means that when we collaborate, crisis-affected populations are in a better situation.
Thank you, Lars, for bringing that, that perspective in, and that whole thing about collaboration. I think we often get somewhere in the backside. This is just left behind. And that brings, well, one of the challenges is, I think, also about and I think, Nick, you brought it in, the standards and principles and all of these things that we which makes up the formal humanitarian system, right? So that's also something that's brought up in terms of, and I hear this a lot, that local organizations and diaspora cannot abide by the humanitarian principles, and that's the reason why internationals don't engage with them. So I want to hear from you. How does that sound to you, Cinzia? Give us some, share with us your perspective.
I already gave my perspective, but no. I mean, the truth is that, first of all, I did sound a little bit critical, maybe a lot critical, but actually I would like to say that initiatives like DEMAC and OIM, Roberta Romano, I mean, there are really serious efforts trying to coordinate and find new, and I love what you say about new ways of working, because definitely we need to find that space. But going back to your initial question, I mean, I find it quite, as I said, it's a little bit lazy on behalf of the large international NGOs to say, you don't abide by the humanitarian criteria. And I can understand they were burned. There were some bad experiences, but again, it's not the majority of us. And actually, the majority of us who work in the humanitarian sector, we actually, for me, it was a great discovery to find within myself a space where I could talk to and work with my political opponents, because we had a common purpose. It was like you practice a lobotomy in your brain and you think, okay, this is politics, that doesn't work, but I'm really concerned about the health of my people. So to discover that actually that space is there, it was a huge discovery, and it came natural. The humanitarian principle, I think, of neutrality and to help everybody, they come natural once you do that exercise, and you know that your goal is just to help, no matter who you're helping. I mean, if I had the medicine to save the life of the president who has me on a blacklist and took my passport when I went to Venezuela, I would send it to him. So, this is something that we need to I think the work starts within ourselves. And then it becomes much more natural and spontaneous to just theoretical principles that not even the large NGOs practice sometimes, as we know, unfortunately.
So, thank you for that. And it's a great leeway. Lars, I hear these arguments about the humanitarian principles a lot and have been taking really active discussions. And I know, for example, Hugo Slim has started this discussion about issue of neutrality, right? Is that relevant? And in today's kinds of conflicts and the situations we work in, what do you think about that? What are your reflections on that? And then, I mean, the second question to both Nick, because you've been in the sector for a long time, is also questioning a bit, do internationals also meet that? Is it really possible? Because we really work in very difficult situations.
Yeah, I think, so the first thing for me, my point of departure is there's nothing wrong with the humanitarian principles. And I think what you just said in terms of them coming almost naturally to you when you engage shows that. Right? And I think often what we discuss when we question the principles is our ability to comply with them. And we feel like if we can't work according to them all, we must change them. For me, it's the other way around. I think the principles is what helps keeps us honest. It shows us how did we fall short this time. Right? We engage in very difficult situations that are not black and white. They're very, very murky. And we will fail. And it's great to have principles telling us how we should behave. Now, I think that's true for diaspora organizations. I think it's definitely true for the mainstream humanitarian organizations. And so for me, they're really, the overarching question for me is, once we engage in this more collaborative, network-centric way of working with humanitarian aid, how do we ensure a principled outcome out of a distributed system? When we don't have control, when we work through influencing others, when our objectives are achieved through the agency of others, how can you then make it more likely that we have a principled outcome? That's a really interesting question that I actually don't have a very good answer to. But there's sort of two traffic rules for me when you look at how people engage. One is, do you actually believe in the principles? Do you sign up to the principles? And secondly, are you willing to enter into a discussion of how you fell short this time? As long as you go with those two things, I think you are in the humanitarian space and you're trying to apply yourself, you're trying to improve the situation of affected populations, and then we can have a really good discussion around how close did we get this time? How can we do better next time? That is, for me, the essence of the principles. It's not a checklist. You say, okay, I've now done neutrality. That doesn't make sense.
Thanks, Niels. But is it about falling short, or is it about really understanding the principles and how to apply them, or making decisions? Because sometimes you may be in a situation.
Can I go?
Please. Yes. Lars.
Well, humanity, neutrality, and impartiality would be three of the key ones. Right? Can I just answer the question here first? Right. I think it's about applying yourself and understanding what do the principles mean for you here in this situation now. And then the second part is holding yourself accountable for that interpretation, for those choices you make. I think that's the space we're in, and that is how we should work. I actually think it would be really interesting to hear from the colleague.
Can I just come in?
Sure, please.
On that, I'm a great believer in all these normative frameworks. They're fabulous as far as I'm concerned, because I think, unfortunately, you're not going to get the kind of reflection that Lars Peter would like to see. People aren't going to sit back and say, well, I've really failed on this, that, and the other. They tend to demonstrate how they've succeeded on this, that, and the other. And so as far as I'm concerned, they're fantastic, whether it's the core humanitarian standard, the humanitarian principles. We can come back to the origins of all these different frameworks. But these are basically sort of supposed to be some form of best practice that will guide humanitarian action. And unless one looks at it from the user end of the barrel, you're really never going to get a useful reflection on whether these things are being acted upon. I remember when I joined the World Bank in 1990, and my first job was writing the first ever World Bank environment report on the World Bank's activities on the environment. And I met these people from NGOs, and they were saying, oh, that's fantastic, you're doing this report. And I thought, why is it fantastic? And they said, because we can then see whether or not you're doing the things you say you're doing. And or we'll check up on you. And I think these frameworks are really fantastic in terms of becoming a benchmark against which affected people can judge whether or not what should be happening according to experience and its codification is happening.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, please.
I wanted to come in quickly and just say, I think, so from a diaspora perspective and not sort of, having engaged in spaces where there's a humanitarian crisis, I think I doubt even just thinking around some of the very specific examples that I have, whether we really engage in that way. When it's time to engage, you engage with the issue that's there. And so then I find that when the benchmark comes in terms of collaborating or getting support or financing or however you need access for the international community, then this rule book is thrown on the table. It almost puts diaspora to say, and this? There's a crisis, and this also, and do you believe in impartiality? And I mean, it's a bit like, well, we're here. This is actually why we're here, right? And so how does that instead inform the principles? And for me, that goes for any kind of, normative framework. What is it, 2 weeks ago now that we have had the International Migration Review Forum, where, another set of principles that are out there that many governments have signed up to. But, when crisis comes in, and I'm sure people around the room would say, how many times, even if you took it, whether your government has signed to it or not, whether that crisis or whether that particular development is taking place, is there's consensus around it or not, that you look at it and you say, actually, who really signed this? But then you had governments still coming up at the IMRF and saying, well, patting yourselves on the back, we've been able to do this and we've been able to do that. To what extent have we actually understood the problem in front of us? Because in a lot of ways, we can shift the definition to suit our own program and solution. But for diaspora, they are naming the thing in front of you. This is a health crisis. This is Ebola. This is cholera. This is a cyclone. This is a health crisis. This is a crisis of people having to move. This is a displacement. And so coming in with rule books, standards, in the middle of a crisis, and assuming that diaspora, and remember, not everyone may have known even the terminology of what you're talking about, can sometimes be a deterrent. And for me, then I would say, that's when diaspora comes in to say, okay, you would need to give us a very quick lesson on this because it's a bit distractive and we need to move. And then to your question, you shouldn't then be penalized for not having understood a system to engage. Instead, it should morph around, and that's the dynamism I think that all kind of normative frameworks would have to have with diaspora engagement.
Thank you. Nick.
Can I just, my son got married in Colombia 2 weekends ago, and the rule book that was thrown at me was that I couldn't possibly go to the party unless I could dance merengue and salsa. And I was sent off to try and learn these complicated movements, which I did not master. And I realized then that these rule books at short notice don't work. More seriously, I think that diaspora organizations, and certainly in terms of accountability, have huge strengths. They have these networks, they have local knowledge, they have, a lot going for them in terms of community engagement. We heard from the Swat Valley how this idea of community-based development is really central. But I would just urge us all not to take that sort of proximity or propinquity for the equivalent of accountability, and that one needs to put in place real mechanisms to find out what people think and the way they see it. And it's not who you are, it's the way you do things. And you need to keep testing as to the way you're perceived to be doing things. Because you're talking about people's present and their futures. And it's really, really important to understand that. There's very little, for instance, research done on the way local and national organizations are seen in humanitarian crises. And we've been trying to dig into that a little bit recently. And again, actually some work which was funded by the H2H network, which was represented by Kim Scriven here in Haiti recently. We were trying to dig into this in the research we did there. And what came across interestingly was that people, in their great majority, prefer being assisted I don't want to make it sound too passive, but to work with community-led organizations. Not because they're community-led, but because they trust them, they think they're more honest, they think they understand their situation more clearly, and they act more quickly. So you need to kind of earn those attributes if you are to be the provider of choice. And we've had some other instances where it's been different. It's not always the case. On some occasions, around issues related to people's protection, they would prefer, in some instances, I'm not saying across the board, to turn to international organizations. So it's kind of, you need to look quite carefully at this. But my message is that you need to be rigorous and regular in understanding where people stand if you're to be able to use that as a metric of your own performance.
But I would like to add to Lars' question some thoughts, because I mean, I think let's say, the starting point for diaspora organization is really this deep sense of empathy towards those who are, less well than you are, and this need to support your people. But that doesn't mean we're not dealing with an emergency in the sense that Venezuela has a long-standing. This is a chronic crisis, okay? So it's a very serious crisis, but it's chronic. So we as a charity don't deal with that. But what that means is that actually we managed to put in place some systems. So, for example, to the gentleman who was asking about ISO, we have in place a management system that is, the reflection of ISO 14000, which is the ISO that I knew of. And so we have procedures, we have plans, we have audits, we have guidelines. And we're actually quite a pain to our partners on the ground, because we ask a lot of reports. So we ask them, tell me how you did it, tell me who was benefited, how many people, male or female. And I told Ruti, we started with the 50 small NGOs that we were supporting. And now we're supporting just 5, because out of those 50, no matter how much we explain, how much we train, how many guidelines we gave them, how many opportunities we gave them to report properly, they didn't learn. So we know that we cannot work with them. And with hospitals in particular, where, as I say, the directors are very politicized, we actually try to minimize the chance of, let's say, mistakes. So basically, for example, donation of medical supplies, we don't do that with hospitals. We install equipment. So water treatment plant, ultrasound machine, and ultrasound cardiogram, and so on. So it's a little bit like, how do you find the balance between that deep sense of compassion